Hello and welcome to Flight Test Debriefs. My name is Serbinenko, I'm a pilot examiner, and today I have comments on a compilation of 3 private pilot flight tests recently conducted. Let's dive right into it. On the ground portion, when you're preparing your weather briefing, consider highlighting everything that is relevant for your trip. You will have more information than you need typically when you download the package. But as you're working through it, highlight the times and the places that you will be actually flying through or pretending to be flying through for the given trip. For example, if your destination is sunny right now, but the weather is deteriorating 3 hours from now when you actually would be arriving there, then you would want to highlight that portion of the TAF rather than reading the METAR, and so on. So when you're giving me the briefing, you would typically start with go, no go decision, big picture, and then details. It will be easy for you to find the relevant information there because that's what interests me, right? Make sure you can read the information in full, including all the remarks for METARs, that you know the units that are represented there, if it's AGL, ASL, magnetic, true, hectopascals, millibars, and so on. Know the types of clouds typically given in the remarks. If you can't read the abbreviation, your ultimate resort could be checking the AIM for the list of abbreviations. Don't make things up, it's not a good idea. Better look it up than guessing, but the best if you can just answer the questions just because you know. Some of the decision making, especially about thunderstorms and freezing level. As a private pilot, you definitely want to stay on the cautious side, and it's okay to not go flying if there are any thunderstorms in the area. Keep in mind, however, we are not IFR. That means you see a thunderstorm cloud. It's not embedded, you are not in a cloud. So you have some rules where you have to keep certain distances from thunderstorm clouds, but if there's some thunderstorm cloud somewhere in the province, it will not necessarily cancel any cross-country trip of a private pilot here. So see what realistically can be done. Some isolated TCUs somewhere in the area is not necessarily a showstopper. Same for the freezing level. Keep in mind that yes, most of the aircraft we are flying are not certified for known icing. Again, freezing level is not a showstopper. If you have clear ice day, think about winter. You're flying probably in freezing, above freezing level most of the year, at least most of the country except Vancouver probably. So it doesn't stop you from flying. You cannot be in any visible moisture, be it rain or clouds, but if it's clear skies, it is totally okay to fly above freezing levels. So consult those for those questions with your instructor. They can give you more explanations. Something else is what I'm seeing often is having too many legs on the nav log. Every line is all the calculations that you need to do for it, and every line will take your time. It is totally okay, especially here in mountainous area, to draw a straight line for your trip or for at least a part of your trip, and then you will add 20%, 30% to your distance, time, and fuel for the fuel calculations at the end of the day. To estimate that you will actually be flying following the valley and not the straight line that you drew on the map, yet you can do the calculations in a simpler way rather than making a separate leg for each little bit that you would be taking through the canyons on your way through the mountains. For weight and balance, I would often give you a scenario where the weight and balance is out of limits. If you have the weight, the center of gravity too far forward or too far back, typically you would need to address the position of various items inside the aircraft. And to the contrary, if it's over max gross weight, then something has to stay behind. No matter how much you shift, it's not going to decrease the total weight. So think about it that way. If you're overweight, you have to lose it in the aircraft. If you have the C of G too far forward or too far aft, something has to move. Now, how exactly you do it, again, go back to your instructor and figure it out. Apply some common sense. Something else is what has to stay behind? What weight do we need to lose? I often hear, oh, then I will not take a passenger, or I will not take the baggage. Keep in mind that if some of you want to go further in your training and become a commercial pilot, it's typically that passenger or that baggage that is paying for the flight. That means you can't leave them behind. On the other hand, we are so fixated on carrying as much fuel as possible, which is great. The only time we have too much fuel is when we are on fire. But in this scenario, if you're only flying from Big Meadows or Boundary Bay to Chilliwack, you do not need 4 hours of fuel, and it's totally okay to go with 2 hours of fuel if that allows you to bring all your passengers or the baggage with you. So see what's realistic and how you can make the flight happen in a safe way, of course. As we are going flying, one housekeeping comment. I don't like seeing headsets and kneeboards on the dash. It's not a pass or fail item on the flight test by any stretch of imagination, but it's housekeeping because think about the plexiglass, the windshield of an aircraft is fairly soft material, and putting different things on the dash will possibly scratch it. If you look closer at your plane, you probably will see a few of those scratches already. Don't add to them. Don't put anything on the dash. For the weight and balance, all the dots that you calculate for your weight and balance have to be also plotted. So it's not enough to have the calculations of the total weight, arm, and momentum. You also need to have these dots on the diagram showing that actually you are within the allowed limits of the weight and balance and how far forward or aft it is. I know many schools are using electronic forms of calculation on the flight test. I would still need to see that you can do it by hand, and everything has to be plotted, including the zero fuel weight. Prior to departure for takeoff, make sure you are well aware of the situation. I often see a pilot calling, "I'm ready for takeoff," when there is another aircraft on short final or maybe half a mile final. You know the controller is not going to give you the takeoff clearance. Don't even ask for it. Save time on frequency. Just common sense items. When you're doing your takeoffs and landings in the beginning of the flight test, I usually like doing the circuit to get those exercises out of the way. A couple of things to watch for: flaps, extension speed. You can certainly extend flaps without verbalizing them. However, it is a good idea to be in a habit of calling flap speed or wide arc, whatever you're doing, before extending flaps. It's a safety item, and it will prompt you to make those checks as you are actually flying, even by yourself, to verbalize, to make those verbal calls. As you're coming in for landing, I probably mentioned that before, flying low and slow is a really bad idea. No dragging approaches. You are better off approaching a little bit higher, not excessively, and you can always lose the extra height. But show your single engine planes engine quit short final if you're on a dragging approach. If you are too low, you will probably not even make the runway, and it would be kind of embarrassing coming in for landing, everything is good, and you're landing 200 feet before the runway, because you will probably still wreck the plane. On the navigation exercise, make sure you not only do the calculations, but make sure they are correct. So for instance, On one of the flight tests, the candidate told me that we were flying at 90 knots, the ground speed calculation, when in fact the indicated airspeed was around 100, and we knew we had tailwind. So take all the known information into account. If you're flying 2,000 feet, your true and indicated airspeeds are fairly close, and having a little bit of tailwind, you would expect to go faster than your airspeed indicator shows. Yet when you are calculating and saying we are 90 knots, maybe double check your numbers, analyze, don't just give the numbers as they are. A word about transiting Langley control zone, or better to say above Langley control zone. When you're flying out of boundary bay, you can transition above Langley between 1,900 feet and 2,500 feet without having to call for clearance. It's uncontrolled space, and it would be a good idea maybe to monitor Langley frequency, but not necessarily talk to them. They are busy with controlling aircraft within their control zone, and courtesy calls are really taking their time. Think about them. If every pilot flying above would be calling them every day for the number of flights that are happening, they don't really have time to deal with what they need to deal with. It is still a good idea to monitor the frequency, and if you have any reports of you being the traffic for some other aircraft, by all means then contact to deconflict. That is a good idea. But courtesy calls are really not necessary. Again, it's not another pass or fail item, but good common sense. When you're doing instrument exercises, the unusual attitudes, as well as just the upper air work, if you have the exercise of stall or a spiral dive, you do not need to return to the previous altitude. All you need to do is to recover to a straight and level flight. Keep in mind overall, if you're flying, especially on a hot summer day, it can be quite turbulent. Don't fly high power settings or high airspeed. You can always reduce power a little bit. It will make the flight smoother for you and less stress. You don't need the added stress on your flight test with the turbulence, although the turbulence may often happen because it's often enough on a hot day, hot and good weather day. When we're doing the upper air work in the practice area, make sure on the stall exercise the plane is indeed fully stalled. The full stall has to be achieved. Don't be afraid, we have plenty of altitude to do it safely and to recover, but the full stall has to be there and you need to call it. Forced approach, I know everybody is very concerned not to be too low, that you're not making the field. Keep in mind, being too high and being too far is also not making the field. So if you have that excess altitude, see and correct for it early, because if the landing is such that you would have landed in past the first third, or for sure past the halfway point of the chosen field, that will be already an automatic too. And frankly, if you would not have been able to land on the field or would have touched down at the very end, it's not making the field. So because you would not have been able to perform a safe landing on that field, or as safe as possible under the circumstances. So being too high, yes, you can lose the altitude, but you actually need to lose that altitude. Don't be too high, don't be too low on the forced approach. Engine warm-up, we don't want to turn a simulated forced approach into a real one, so make sure you do the engine warm-up. I shouldn't be doing it for you if I have to start interfering because I'm not feeling safe because you're not doing it. That will definitely affect your mark on the flight test. Make sure on any upper air work, landing approach, any item, I already mentioned it, but I'll repeat it again, verbalize flaps, not just verbalize flaps because they're just a cue. Make sure when you extend flaps, you are within the wide arc or whatever the limitations for the aircraft would be, and and under no circumstances you exceed those limitations while the flaps are extended. I had to take control on one of the stall exercises when on the recovery this candidate was not fast enough to retract flaps as the speed was increasing, and if I did not take control we would have exceeded the flap speed. So obviously such exercise would not be successful. That failed the flight test. So make sure you keep flaps extended only within the flap speed. If you're having a scenario for precautionary or diversion where some urgency is required, for example, you're low on fuel, don't start orbiting and figuring out your calculations. You might be losing the valuable time that you could be traveling towards your destination. Would be a shame to land half a mile before the airport if you're running out of fuel, right? So start going in the general direction of your diversion destination, and then once you figure out the exact numbers, headings, and so on, you will be able to correct that. Pick a set heading point somewhere a little bit away, but along the route. Don't orbit. Besides, flying low and slow and with the eyes down on the map instead of looking outside is not a good procedure anyways. When we are doing the diversion, usually it is lower level than you're used for your regular navigation. So if you would do your nav departure and en route altitudes, you would be at about 2,500 feet. Usually diversions are done between 500 and 1,000 foot AGL, and things do look different from that altitude. So what I would suggest, first of all, practice, but also make sure under no circumstances you enter any controlled airspace without clearance. That would be really, really bad. And again, one of the flight tests, I had to do exactly that, take control and talk to Langley Tower, because the candidate was flying straight into Class C airspace without even considering talking to them or switching the frequency, and it was right at the moment where we would have entered controlled airspace without prior clearance. So if the examiner takes control, that is for safety reasons, like in this case, then the exercise is automatically unsuccessful. Do not enter any controlled airspace without clearance on your diversion. You have a lot of things to do. Fly around the control zone if needed, but do not enter. The last comment I have for this debrief are the emergency, critical and non-critical emergencies. Yes, you do have to use a checklist for every emergency to double check. However, if you have a critical emergency, like a fire in the cockpit, for example, you do need to act by memory because it is critical, it is urgent. You don't want to spend several minutes looking for a checklist. So do it by memory and then double check with the checklist. If it is a non-critical emergency, like flat tire would be, then by all means, take your time, read, prepare, communicate. You have time to do that. Critical emergencies, by memory first. I hope this feedback today was helpful and it will help you to prepare for your flight test and be successful. Please leave your comments below and we'll be happy to post more. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with the updates. Good luck on your flight test.